Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I've got something special for you. As part of some research that I'm doing for one of my regular videos, I found myself in need of talking to someone who actually knows something about Biblical Hebrew. So I decided to record this interview and let all of you fine folks take a gander. So with me today I have Dr. Joshua Bowen. Dr. Bowen has his PhD in Assyriology. He is the author of Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? And is the co-author along with his wife Megan of Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, an introduction for complete beginners. He also runs a YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi along with his wife Megan Lewis. Digital Hammurabi has a wide variety of content about various biblical topics, including a playlist geared toward teaching you Biblical Hebrew, which is why we're here today, sort of. So, Dr. Josh, welcome.
Oh, well, it's great to be here. Appreciate that very kind introduction.
Yeah, well, we've known each other for a little while now, so you were the first name that came to mind when I started running into this. But
Well, that's unfortunate.
so I was taking a look at this article that's talking about whether or not Genesis is poetry. Now, it mentions Genesis 1 and 2 as being claimed to be poetry. Now, I know you are of the opinion that that neither of them are poetry, but I've never heard anyone talk about Genesis 2 being poetry before. Have you run across that claim at all?
No, I wonder, having read the article, I wonder if in the mind of the writer that if it's either going to be poetry or it's history. Like there's two
It's
options.
a dichotomy.
And of course there's certainly many more options.
There are plenty of literature genres out there that are neither historical nor poetic.
Yeah. So
but
we can talk about that.
Yeah, so digging in, Genesis chapter 1. Now, in some of the literature that I was reading, I have come across people that argue that it is poetry because it uses things like chiasms, parallelism, and all sorts of other literature or literary devices that kind of indicate it being poetical, and they're suggesting that it was meant to be sung or chanted as a sort of hymn. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess before, as I always do in these interviews, my expertise is Assyriology. I have a minor in Hebrew Bible, and I have a master's in theology and Old Testament studies. So, I mean, I feel like I am qualified to talk about this stuff. But this, poetry, Hebrew poetry, and of course Genesis 1 and 2 to 3, they're parts of the field that are take up a scholar's entire career.
Yeah.
So, what I'll say about them here, I can recommend resources that are sitting here on the shelf for people that are far more, apt to speak on, qualified to speak on these things. But, so with all of that being said, poetry in the Hebrew Bible, generally speaking, follows, it runs this type of parallelism. So if you read through the Psalms, you'll see very frequently, I think the go-to lines that I like are, your word, because everybody knows them, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path.
Yeah.
So you have two statements that are being made, two lines, and they're paralleling one another. Usually the second is developing the first in some way. That's, so you can have parallel lines, you can have antithetical lines, you can have a bunch of different, means of saying the same thing with two or even three different lines. So with that being said, looking at Genesis 1, looking at Genesis 2 and 3, these two accounts, these two creation stories, I would say that they are not standard Hebrew poetry. I don't know many people that would classify them that way. I would say they're probably elevated prose, but
Okay.
that's not really, I don't want to say it's not relevant, but to what the author is doing here, the author seems to be making an argument. Well, liberal scholars are saying that it's poetry so that they can, liberal theologians saying it's poetry so that they can, be a little more wishy-washy about how they interpret it and loose with it. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be a literal translation. A literal interpretation. of the text, and I think that's going down the wrong path, trying to determine whether it's poetic or not for that reason, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I will admit that even fairly recently I have made the argument that, it is a poem, so you don't need to take it literally. But even if it's not a poem, like, first off, whether or not it's a poem doesn't necessarily mean that it's, because there is such a genre as historical poetry. So
it's definitely a literary text. I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
anybody would. I don't think anybody that works in the field would disagree, or that's trained in this and is honestly looking at it would say that it's not literature. So something simple like the 6 days of creation, right? The way that they're set up, days 1, 2, and 3 are matched. They're connected to days 4, 5, and 6. So the first 3 days essentially create the realms of habitation, and days 4, 5, and 6 create the things that will inhabit those realms, and they match up. So day 1 matches day 4, day 2 matches day 5, day 3 matches day 6. So there's the literary structure to it. So this idea that it's some objective historical account and it's meant to be read as some Herodotus writing, or something written in a standard modern historical sense. Not that that's necessarily what this author's arguing, but I think that's going the wrong direction with the text. It's a piece of literature and it's doing something. So there, and I guess we can talk about it later, but there is an argument out there about whether, certainly we would consider something like Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 and 3 to be mythic, right? We would consider that to be myth. Is that how the priestly writer who put Genesis 1 in there was intending it? Was he intending it as it stood at the head of the biblical text, at the head of the Hebrew Bible? Was he intending it to be read strictly as myth, or was he doing it as some primeval history? That's a debate that we can talk about that. But again, neither of those things require that it be a scientific text that you and I should be going back to and looking at and saying, okay, let's match this up to what we know of evolutionary history or something.
Now, one of the things that I have come across occasionally, I'm not sure if you are able to speak on this, but I have read that the ancient rabbis would consider a text to be alive as long as you could continue finding different metaphorical interpretations for the text. But then as soon as you couldn't figure anything new out in the text, it was considered a dead text. Would you generally agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a rabbinic scholar. That being said, I mean, one of the things that you see in places like, the Talmud, and even in the Hebrew Bible itself, is argument, right? Rabbi so-and-so says this, but then Rabbi so-and-so says that. And Rabbi, number 3 comes in and says, no, it's actually this. That's sort of that.
There's a whole episode of The Simpsons on that.
I'm sure. Coming to the text from different points of view and arguing its meaning. Of course, the rabbis were, trying to, I don't want to say smooth out the text, but in many cases were trying to make some type of cohesion. Trying to say, well, this law seems to argue this, and this other law seems to argue that. How do we make these fit together? But the Hebrew Bible does this. And particularly, I think we see this in the creation traditions that are preserved, either implicitly or explicitly in the Hebrew Bible. You see Genesis 1 coming at the idea of creation in a different way than you see in Genesis 2 and 3, and as you see in Psalm 104 or Psalm 74 or Isaiah 27. So the fact that there's disagreement and that text remains living until there's no way to no other conceivable means of coming at a new interpretation. I think that makes perfect sense to the mind of the rabbis, I would imagine. But again, it'd probably be best to ask a rabbinical scholar.
So one of the things that I am, one of the angles that I'm looking at it from is whoever, whichever editor decided to put Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 right next to each other in the same book, they probably would have been aware that they were contradictory accounts. And so, like, does that kind of speak to what you were saying about the rabbis having these arguments even within the text? Like, okay,
Yeah.
this tradition says this, but this tradition says this, and let's see what we can take out of both of them.
I don't know. When you think about intentionality, that's sort of a different game. But I think one of the things that we as modern interpreters of text, ancient text, do is we want there to be some type of, I don't know, systematic approach that leads us to one consistent either narrative or explanation. This idea, there's one idea that comes through, and when you have contradictions, we want to smooth them out. And the ancient world just doesn't do that. Right? So if you go back to Sumerian literature or Akkadian literature, and you read some of the myths, the different creation stories, they don't say the same thing. Enki creates in one sense. He digs his penis into the Tigris and the Euphrates, and digs them out, and then ejaculates, and creates the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Right, but that's not a consistent. That's not
that
a
story.
It is. I mean, there are lots of interesting stories of Enki. Visit our channel if you want to hear them. But the idea of creation is not consistent. And a good example of this, I think, is there's a story that we'll probably talk about later called the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish is sort of a late second millennium BCE story about the elevation of the god Marduk to the kingship. He gets, elevated to a level of supremacy above the other gods. And he does so by defeating Tiamat, who's the water, the sea goddess. And in that story, during the first millennium in particular, we know that it was a part of the New Year's festival, and it was recited at the New Year's festival, the Akitu festival. And it was part of this, annual celebration where the king, as part of this ritual, would be essentially re-enthroned with the blessing of the god, the blessing of Marduk. And what's interesting about that story is it was incredibly well known in Babylonia, of course, because it was their story, but it was well known in the surrounding regions. And when the Assyrians in the north later, when they came in and conquered the south, conquered Babylonia at a certain point in time, one of the things that they did is they took many of their literary texts, their tablets, their myths, back with them to Assyria. And one of the things that we have, we have these tablets, and one of the things that we have is several copies, fragments of copies, of the Enuma Elish, but it's been modified so that the god Marduk is taken out, and the god Asher, who is the god of the Assyrians in the north, is replaced, replaces Marduk. So now instead of it being Marduk, who is the god that, conquers Tiamat and gets supremacy, now it's the god Asher. But it's the same story. They don't, they modify it very, very little, and it's only in names that they modify it. And so what does that say? Is it somehow that the Assyrians, had always believed that exact story, but just with Asher's name in it, was the actual creation story? No, I think that's looking at it through our eyes, through our perspective. What was significant about that, at least in part, was that their deity's name was now in that slot. And if their deity's name is in that slot, that is significant. That gives that deity that power. So it's not surprising, I suppose, in any way, to think about the priestly author, if indeed the priestly author, and I tend to think at this juncture that's probably true, is the final redactor, or he's that the priestly source is the last one to go in.
So that's priestly as opposed to the Yahwist,
Yeah,
using source methodology.
yeah. So and we can talk about that briefly if you want to, kind of give an intro to it. But I don't see, just to kind of finish that thought. I don't see any problem whatsoever, and I don't think they did in having what we would consider to be conflicting traditions in the text, even right next to each other. That's not problematic for them, because it's not a matter of let's lay out.
So if I
Go
can
ahead.
maybe put in what I'm getting out of this so far, it's not so much the details of the story that are important, it's who the person doing the main actions in the story. So like, however the world was created, it was our God that did it.
Yeah,
That's-
it's a theological text, and the theological text is doing something. So people often bring up in Genesis 1 the fact that plants and things are created before the sun. How does that work?
Well, I think that only comes up when we're talking about gap theory, where there's billions of years in between the sun
Yeah.
and the plants.
But the issue is, and I would agree, if
Yeah.
you have, if we're reading it with all of those assumptions in mind, yeah, that's problematic. But that it wasn't that there was some scientifically logical order to creation. It was a theologically
Yeah.
logical order. So there again, I think we need to take a step back, and this, I think the person who put this article together that we're reading needs to take a step back and say, what is this text doing? And of course, I think he has a particular hermeneutic where he sees the text as inerrant and God breathed, and so he has to, in some ways, come at a different angle. But I would say that having conflicting stories and them not being smoothed out is not problematic in any way for the final editors.
Yeah. Well, the way I would look at it, like if I were to put myself back into a perspective where I would consider the Bible to be inerrant, the way that like knowing what I know now about evolution, like obviously I was a young Earth creationist years and years and years ago, and I took the simplistic literalistic view. But I think now, knowing what I do about evolution, whatever, if I were to end up back in the faith, so to speak, and then say the Bible is inerrant, I think I would have a much easier time of it if I were to say, like, yeah, it is inerrant, but this isn't telling an actual story of events, how they happen. It's just trying to teach us a lesson. The lesson is inerrant. The story is just a story.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's put this in modern terms. If you've watched the Iron Man series, I've always been struck by how, as you go through the 3 Iron Man movies, the suit becomes progressively weaker, even though the technology ostensibly is getting much stronger, or much more advanced. So
he makes like 50, like first one he can take a direct hit anywhere and he's fine. By the third one, he's got 50 of them backing him up, and they're all blowing up as soon as somebody
everywhere
touches them.
something hits it and it slices in half.
Yeah.
So, but from if we were coming at that from a scientific standpoint, right? We well, wait a minute now. What is the iron makeup, or the composite metal there taking on such a weak? How is this happening? That's not an issue.
I mean,
at all.
if we're coming at it from a scientific perspective, he's dead in the first movie when he first escapes in the suit that he built in the cave, because there's nothing to
Exactly.
cushion his fall. Like,
Yeah.
if anything, being out of the suit would have been better, because sand is a softer thing to land on than iron.
Yeah. So, but as you say, that's not the point. What is the point? If we were to step back, I mean, besides entertainment, if we wanted to take moral teachings from something like Iron Man, I mean, we could talk about the different ways that he transitions and he learns that life is valuable and he goes through personal experiences. But again, it doesn't require that there be some sort of scientific consistency. And the writers, I'm sure that the writers knew that when they put it in. It didn't bother them. And so I think that's a good analogy for when we look at ancient texts. That's not the point. The point is not to say, well, wait a minute, how do these two seem to conflict with one another? Irrelevant. You're looking at it wrong, they would say.
Well, to use another movie as an example, I just watched Coco with the kids the other night, and I've seen it twice now. Both times it has struck me just how much trouble the animators went to make sure that anytime someone is playing a musical instrument, their fingers are in the right positions to be playing the notes that you hear. It was meticulous. It was perfect. Wow. And I've also watched the Lorax, and they didn't even bother trying to make him look like his fingers were in the right positions. It's like, and it was still an enjoyable movie. But then you go back to Coco, they completely dropped the ball when it came to microphone positioning. So he's performing at a concert, singing on the opposite end of the stage from the microphone, but everybody can still hear him.
Right.
That's the thing. It was, that whole movie was about the ability of music to make connections and bring people together. So they were making the music perfect and making sense, but as far as the sound system goes, that's just a superfluous thing. We know there are microphones. It doesn't matter. What matters is the music, not the thing that makes the music loud. So it's like they can take artistic license with certain details.
Exactly. And I think if we do that, if we do it with poetry, right? And I know it sort of brings this full circle here, but we do it with, things that we do it with genres that we recognize in the biblical texts or in the ancient world. So when we read through the Psalms, and it's sort of my go-to example, but day and night my tears have been my food. That doesn't give us any pause whatsoever. David is saying that he's so sad that he hasn't eaten anything for days, right? Yeah. His tears have been his food, right? We recognize that genre. We recognize how that works.
Yeah, and
so
he's being hyperbolic and.
Yeah, and it's a metaphor. It's imagery that's trying to relate something to you. So you wouldn't ask the question, "Is that true?"
Well, I think
you would say.
I think my favorite, obviously not literally true, bit from the Bible is the Song of Solomon with the woman with goats for hair and gazelles as her breasts. It's like obviously that's not literal.
There's a Mark somebody, he's a comedian, a Christian comedian. Mark Lowry.
Yeah, I used a clip of his song. I used a clip of his song in my last video. So that was fun. So what genre would you say Genesis 1 and 1 and 2 are obviously at least slightly different genres? What genre would you say they are?
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably the consensus view is that it's a cosmogony. So it's trying to explain the origin of the worlds. Now, that doesn't mean, I think people hear that and they think, okay, well, did they literally think that the world began that way? I mean, maybe. I mean, those sorts of things beliefs are difficult to get at in the ancient world, but it's trying to explain where the world came from, and so how things formed originally. So cosmological genre is probably okay, but it's trying to explain how did the world come to be, and of course Genesis 1 and Genesis 2-3 are doing, they're doing that type of explanation, but in different ways. So when people say they're two different accounts, I think what we can say is that they're not meant to be, this is like step 1 and then the continuation of the story in Genesis 2-4b, right? That's not what's going on. These are two different original accounts that are being sort of woven together, and they're doing different things, or they're doing the same basic thing, but in different ways. So it's trying to explain, we could talk about that in a little more detail. What is it that Genesis 1 is trying to do? What is it that Genesis 2-3 is trying to do? But again, these are just explaining what happened at where did the world come from?
It's etiology.
Yeah. So looking at, it could be very simplistic, etiological, looking at the origins of things, like why is it that snakes crawl in their bellies or things like that? Why is there birth pains for women? But it could be, much more sophisticated and polemical. I think they're very polemical in what they're doing and their function. So.
All right. So you mentioned that they're cosmogony or cosmogony. Is it?
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure. I mean, I would say cosmogony, but that doesn't mean that it's right. I don't know that I've ever heard that pronounced
I
out loud.
Yeah, I've it's one of the truisms that I try to live by is never make fun of how somebody pronounces a word, because if they're pronouncing it wrong, that means they learned it by reading, and reading is a good thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that happens to me a lot, actually.
I actually to one of my worst memories from high school was when I've always hated English class, and the English teacher that I actually liked in grade 9, who did a fantastic job, and she was just absolutely amazing. She got married and moved away, so she was not my English teacher for grade 10, but they weren't able to find a replacement for her. So they grabbed the gym teacher and made him the English teacher. And
It happens a lot.
I remember there was one particular class where I was reading something out loud, and one of the words that came up was disheveled. And I had only ever read the word disheveled before. I'd never heard it out loud, so I pronounced it the way I thought it was supposed to be pronounced, which was disheveled. And then he, in front of the whole class, started teasing me, and we were like, oh no, it's not disheveled, it's disheveled. And I was mortified and embarrassed because the whole class was laughing at me, and then I found out years later that no, I was actually right. It's disheveled. It's not disheveled.
It was weird because I think that same teacher taught me, and he started the class, Jay Quallen. Sorry.
All right, back on topic. I could go all day about English teachers that I didn't get along with. In college, I would play video games in the back row on my laptop during English class, and I actually had one of the English professors tell me I was a complete lost cause.
Wow. If only he could see you now.
But I'm an avid reader. I enjoy reading, so I've always kind of I've had a good sense for proper structure and grammar and everything like that, because I get it from reading. So even if I don't know the I don't know what the past perfect participle or whatever those things, I don't know any of that stuff, but I can write it properly, generally speaking. So I've always been able to get good marks in English class without paying attention or doing any of the real work.
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
But so back to topic. So cosmogonies. So in the article that we're discussing, toward the end, he says that a cosmogony in this sense, or cosmogony, whatever, cosmogony in this sense would be an attempt to find a naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe. Now, if I understand what you said correctly, it's not necessarily a way to find a natural explanation. It's just an attempt to explain why things are the way they are.
Yeah, I actually underlined that sentence to talk about it because the idea of it being naturalistic, I think, is problematic. Now, I understand why he's coming at it from that perspective.
Yeah.
But I don't know that. I think that's imposing something upon the ancient writer, and I think that's incorrect to do. Right. So, and this gets into the idea: is Genesis 1 myth? Is it as it stands? Is it a myth, or does it contain myth and it's meant to be primeval history? And these are complicated questions that people debate. But I think this is important because you don't want to come to this text and impose upon it. I think you want to impose upon it your own definitions. I think that the wise thing to do is to go to the scholars that are in the field that are writing on this, and to figure out how is it that they come at these texts. And the way that they come at these texts is they go to not only the text under investigation, like Genesis 1 or 2 and 3, but they'll go to other ancient Near Eastern stories that have, informed these texts, like the Enuma Elish or the Baal cycle, or even Atrahasis and the flood story. So, I think that's the smart thing to do, and imposing the idea of naturalism on this, and to try to find a naturalistic explanation. Certainly, the ancients weren't trying to do that. They weren't trying to, the people that wrote the Enuma Elish weren't trying to say, all right, let's get away from the supernatural and find a strictly natural way that the world came into being.
Starting every paragraph with the words "and God said" is a weird way to get away from God.
Indeed. And I mean, of course, that's the main point of Genesis 1 and in fact, Genesis 2 and 3. So, But it's the main point of all of the ancient Near Eastern stories that deal with world origins. So
Now, can we talk a bit about going back to source methodology and how we like the priestly source versus the Yahwist source, and one of them is much more like the god of the priestly source is much more ethereal, whereas the god of the Yahwist source gets his hands dirty and is physical and does things.
Yeah, so I mean,
I guess kind of
give
like the contrast between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in that respect.
Yeah, so that everybody is kind of on the same page in the audience, and we have a video on this, like an introductory video on our channel called "The Formation of the Pentateuch" or "Piecing Together the Pentateuch," something like that. And in fact, we're having Dr. Joel Baden from Yale come on and talk, I think, on the 26th, something like that, of this month, to talk specifically about this issue of source criticism and how the Pentateuch was formed. So it should be really good. But basically, starting in 18th century, and particularly in the 19th century, it became clear to biblical scholars that you don't have this unified Mosaic authorship, particularly in the Pentateuch. So there are different what they consider to be sources in the biblical narrative. So if you look at, of course, Genesis 1 verses 1 to 2, 4a versus 2, 4b to, and following, they look like they're written by two different authors, right? Two different people or groups. And you see this in the flood story. It seems like you have doublets. Doublets are one of the big things that you see in the biblical text. You have something happens twice. It shouldn't happen twice.
Yeah.
And so, sort of in brief, what what formed originally is you have four different sources that kind of got fleshed out: J, E, D, and P. So J is for the German Yahweh, or the Yahwist source. So he uses the name. The Yahwist source uses generally the name Yahweh for the deity. You have E for the Elohist, who uses Elohim.
That's the one that usually gets translated as like the God speaking in the first person plural, like we.
Yes, I mean it's obviously very complicated when you dig down into the details of source criticism. But so J for the Yahwist, E for the Elohist. Then D is what we call the Deuteronomist, the easiest one to remember. It's essentially restricted to the book of Deuteronomy in the Pentateuch, but or maybe it's better to say it makes up the book of Deuteronomy. But this is late 7th century, they think, under the reign of Josiah. This is when this was put together. And then finally, I would say most people that follow source criticism, I would think, would say that the priestly source is the latest. So the priestly source comes, either exilic or it's post-exilic, but it's either the final editor that comes back and sort of takes these sources and edits them together, or it's the last of the four sources and there's a later editor that comes and puts all four of them together into this thing that we call either the Pentateuch, or if it extends into the book of Joshua, or whatever. So when you kind of keeping that in mind, these original sources, Genesis 1 is a priestly source, so it probably comes last. Now there are people that debate that. But I think there are good arguments to show how they seem to be pulling from Genesis 2 and 3, the story in Genesis 2, 4b, and following into chapter 3, and maybe even reacting to it a little bit. But the Yahwist and the J source is responsible then for the creation story in Genesis 2, and as you said, you get a lot more of an anthropomorphic feel. God is walking in the garden. He's interacting very directly with the human. He's bringing things, and he's having conversations, and he questions, and he talks with, and in other words, it's a
in the priestly source, he speaks things into existence, but in the Yahweh source, he grabs the dirt and clay and forms them himself.
Exactly. And there's trial and error. There's trial and error to many people's surprise. So, you know, and this extends, I think, into later parts of Genesis. But, you know, as you say, he's bringing the animals before the man, and the man's naming them, and he can't find a helper that's suitable to him, and so, you know, God then forms, and but in the context, God is, as you say, kind of down and dirty, whereas the priestly source presents God in a much more transcendent way. You know, God is. One
of the explanations I've heard for this is that I forget which. I always get them mixed up with whether Judah was the north or Israel was the north, but the priestly source came from either Judah or Israel, and the Yahweh source came from the other one, and so they had kind of the gods that Yahweh or Elohim was based on had their origins slightly separately. So the priestly source, it would have been a wind god or something. So it's a more spiritual being, whereas the Yahweh source, it was based on an older war god, I think it was. I don't know. Am I completely misremembering things, or am I just repeating rumors that other people have made up?
I mean, again, this is source criticism is certainly not my expertise, and these are probably good questions to ask Joel Baden when he comes on the channel. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that we do know is if the priestly source is later, this is certainly coming in a period where monotheism, or you know, what we would say maybe colloquially as monotheism, is coming in, and so this reaction to the worshiping of many gods, of course, even in the Deuteronomistic source, the Deuteronomist is you know, he's responding to a type of paganism, right? A type of polytheism, what he considers to be a polytheism or a paganism. And he's saying, tear down all the shrines and worship only at Jerusalem. And so, you know, that's sort of the big thing that can distinguish earlier from later, at least in some interpretive models. So, definitely, I think there's good evidence for something similar happening in the biblical text, in the Hebrew Bible, where Yahweh is sort of the younger God. I think there are good arguments for this, that takes over from El, and this is something that we see very common in Akkadian literary texts, or in Akkadian mythology. You see it in Ugaritic mythology. There's sort of the older El, and Baal is taking over supremacy from that. So you see these things. Of course, even Marduk in Akkadian mythology, the one that takes over as the young, you know, best of the best god in the Enuma Elish, you know, even later in texts like Aaron Isham, he becomes kind of elderly, you know, and so other gods become more spry. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a tradition that's fair, but that's a good question that I don't really have a good answer to.
Well, it's one of those things that I hear, and I see it brought up in my comment section a lot, but I haven't really read up on it, so it's not something I want to repeat until I actually know that I'm repeating it correctly.
One would probably be incredibly astounded at the amount of ink that has been spilled on you know, how the Pentateuch has been pieced together, and different theories behind it. In fact, there's a brand new book that just came out by David Carr. I was going to hold it up, but I don't know why I would do that. But, you know, talking about Genesis 1 through 11 in particular, I mean, it just came out. I got it this week, 2 days ago, and I pre-ordered it. And it's a phenomenal book. And even David Carr, who's, you know, he's written extensively on this topic for decades, says in the introduction to his book, look, I've got a commentary on Genesis coming out later this year, but I'm telling you, these ideas that are in here, many of them are provisional, because even as I've written this book, I've changed my mind slightly, right? Because it's one of the things that we really wrestle with and scholars wrestle with, I don't even want to say we, that Pentateuchal specialists wrestle with, is that they don't have any original sources, right? You don't have these original texts. For me, when I go back and I look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh is pulling from Sumerian originals. And the nice thing about it is we know that because we have both. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh tablets. We have old Babylonian versions of it, so several hundred years earlier.
Stone tablets last a lot longer than papyrus.
Yeah, these clay tablets are in the ground, and they stay that way. And then we have the original Sumerian stories. I mean, original in the sense that, manuscripts that come from the early second millennium BCE, and so you can watch how the story was in its original form, and then how it was used by the later editor, particularly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, how he wove these original stories together, much like the author of Genesis did, the writer, later redactor of Genesis did, to tell a story, to do something theologically with that finished product. The Epic of Gilgamesh did it. The editor of the Epic of Gilgamesh did it, and I think that's exactly what the author of particularly Genesis 1 through 11, but even the broader, even through Exodus or even through the Pentateuch itself. Anyway.
This is relation to a comment that I chose for my comment of the day a little while ago. They were mentioning something in biblical Hebrew about the past perfect tense. So the word the translation Genesis 2:19. Modern translations often have that as the Lord God had formed. And let me just pull up the verse so I can actually read it. So it says, so I brought this up as one of my examples of how Genesis 2 is clearly not worried about contradicting Genesis 1. They're not the same story. It is slightly different. So one of the verses that creationists will often pull out to say, no, it is like it's just to zoom in on day 6 is verse 19. It says, now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and whatnot. So that's in the past tense. He had done it. So I brought up in response to that verse 18, which says, then the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. So to me, that says, I will make it, and then he made it, and now he had made them. But what this commenter brought up is they're saying that in biblical Hebrew, they don't have the past perfect tense. So had formed wouldn't be a way that they would even have thought to say it because it just didn't exist in their language. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so actually, if you heard clicking, that was me bringing up BibleWorks, just so I could take a look at the Hebrew. So so this is Vayitzer Adonai Elohim min ha'adamah. So this Vayitzer is it's just a Vav consecutive imperfect. So in Hebrew, you don't have this strictly pluperfect form. So what you have to do when you translate is you have to look at context and say, okay, which one should this be? How should I, based on the context, translate this form? No, I think what that's doing is probably taking a theological concern and saying, okay, how do I rectify this? I'd be interested to look and see how other people have translated this, but it looks just like a Vav consecutive imperfect form. So and it happened, or and he made, or and he formed.
Okay.
The way that they move the narrative on.
So I have a copy of the Anchor Bible in front of me. The book, their Anchor Bible Genesis. It's obviously, if you know the Anchor Bible, it's way too big to have in one book in front of you. So the way they translate it now, these guys, my understanding is that these guys definitely did have some theological motivation when they were doing their translation, but they are very much they're very much fans of source methodology. So they try and break everything up, and they let you know, like right here, chapter 2. Verses 4b through 24, they have it labeled as J, so they're telling you this is the Yahwist source. And
who's the author?
This one is Spicer, I believe.
Spicer,
E.A. Spicer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's a little older, but
it is. Yeah. It's it's come in handy for me on numerous occasions. Though.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
Bought for me by someone on the channel. I forget who, but I thanked them in a previous video. But I've made much use of it. So they have, starting at verse 18, it's God Yahweh said, "It is not right that man should be alone. I will make an aid fit for him." So God Yahweh formed out of the soil of various wild beasts and birds of the sky and whatnot. So that kind of flows better. It's not got a temporal break in it.
Yeah,
as much as
so. There is a form, and I said it earlier. This Vav consecutive and perfect form. And basically, that's the way they move the narrative forward. So it's incredibly common. It happens in every narrative that I can think of. So you have, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It's just how they move the narrative forward. It's incredibly common. So that form being there is saying this happened in the previous verse, and then this happened. Now, there is a way that Hebrew can construct some type of a parenthetical clause. But again, most of the time, I'm just thinking back through in my experience when I see this, it's much more contextually driven. So it's something that is, it's clear from the context that this is happening and it needs to be translated this way. Yeah, I guess the bottom line in all of that is that if you're trying to wed Genesis, the two accounts in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 together, as from an inerrant perspective where it's got to be all written by Moses, then you can see why you've kind of got to do that, because it's, well, wait a minute, this is problematic. But I there's no question. There was a quote, actually, I think it's in David Carr's new book, where he says, if there's one thing that scholars have agreed upon emphatically, is that there is a definite distinction, a definite separation between Genesis, the account in Genesis 1 to 2:4a and 2:4b forward. I mean, it's emphatic. Everybody agrees on that. So, I think it's looking for a reason to. I think it's theologically there's a commitment that's driving that interpretation. So,
yeah, and it actually it was interesting to me when I found out. I forget exactly which verse it was, but like the different translations of the Bible, like you can sometimes suss out the motivation behind who is making the translation. Like that, there's I have a copy of the NIV Bible I've had since I was about 13 years old. This was my confirmation Bible for the United Church of Canada. It was presented to me on May 13th, 2001. Sorry, I say I've had it for 13 years. It's been 13 years for 7 years now. 6 years. But when sometimes I pull this out just to like get to a quick verse if I know exactly where it is, and rather than go to the website and whatnot. If I just need a quick reference, I'll pull this out. And I noticed once when I had a similar verse up on the screen in ESV, I noticed that there were words missing in my NIV translation. And when I looked into that, it turned out that the original text, like not a single manuscript had ever been found that suggested the NIV translation needed to have the extra words that it put in there. It was put in there purely for theological reasons to get rid of an apparent contradiction. And so it was like, I'd been an atheist for years at that point, and it was still shocking to me that this book right here that people say is inerrant, there are translation errors in it that have been put there on purpose to make it match up with certain theologies. And so that kind of makes me trust the English translations a lot less, and add on top of that the need to understand the cultural and historical context in which text was written in order to correctly interpret that text. And really the process of exegesis becomes a lot more intricate and difficult than just a simple, like, this is what the Bible says, therefore it's got to be true.
Yeah, it's one of the things. I mean, I love the NIV, which might shock people listening. The reason that I love the NIV,
just to like they did like my version is from like it says from 2001. They corrected that mistake in 2011, and they removed their little extra words. Oh, no, that was how I noticed it, was because my NIV had a different wording than the NIV on the website.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
I gotcha. But I mean, I love the NIV, not because of its like, having worked in translation for, it's probably coming up on 2 decades now. One of the things that when you start off doing it, when you start off working in Greek or working in Hebrew or whatever, you're always trying to get that incredibly literal wooden translation, it's word for word. And what ends up happening over time is that, you have to do that in the beginning because they want to make sure that, the professor that's teaching you wants to make sure that you understand how these grammatical forms work. So they don't want some dynamic translation that sort of gets the sense of it. They want to know, do you know, that that's in the perfective aspect or whatever. But as time goes by, you'll get scolded for keeping it too wooden. And the reason is you'll come in. I remember in Sumerian class, I came in and I gave this translation that was good, kind of like word for word, and it was correct. But I remember I looked up and my professor said, it was Paul Del Nero, and he said, "Great, what does that mean?" And I went, well, and he said, "Yeah, exactly." So you have to figure out what that means, and that's part of this process. So one of the things that I like about the NIV is that it goes that extra step. And now,
yeah, it's very easy to understand in the format that it's written.
Now, seminary students will, have lambast me for that. Oh my gosh, how can you read the NIV? Look at it. Well, I'm not using it as as like some sort of a study Bible. I like reading it because it gives the sense of what I think the author was trying to get across. And so if I need to get into what you're talking about, these exegetical things, I won't turn to the NIV for that. I'll turn to the Hebrew for that, or I'll turn to the Aramaic or the Greek or whatever. So,
well, yeah, but you have the luxury of actually knowing how to speak those languages.
But you can also have that luxury if you find our playlist and learn Biblical Hebrew.
Absolutely. Yeah, I typically go with the ESV, but I'm fast and loose with the translations though, because generally I'm fighting against people who want to take everything absolutely literally.
Yes.
And they're saying it's the literal inerrant word of God. Like, okay, well, which version? Like I can pull up different versions of the same verse and make it say completely different things.
Yeah.
Which one is the inerrant one?
And even if they mean by that, which, I would say most evangelicals do, that they mean the autographs, where the pen hit the paper originally, even that is complicated.
Well, because we don't have the originals most of the time.
And which original? So like I think of Jeremiah, for example. Jeremiah penned his, according to the text, penned these things on scrolls, and then they were burned. And, Baruch had to, make additional copies later. So which ones? Is it the ones that got burned, the newer ones? And of course, when you look at the Septuagint translation of Jeremiah, it's very different because it's than the Masoretic text, and probably because it's based on a different Hebrew forlage. It's based on a different Hebrew text. And so which one's the inspired one? It's complicated.
That's also one of the issues with young Earth creationists determining the age of the Earth, is that the Masoretic texts give different ages for people than the Septuagint text does. And it adds up to a difference of about 1,000 years. It's pretty significant difference for an inerrant work. But so you bring up the Septuagint. Just for anyone who might not be familiar, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Essentially, it doesn't quite work out to exactly that, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested in that, we have a playlist that I actually just recommended this morning to someone. They were asking about things like the Masoretic text, or where did the Hebrew come from, where did the Greek come from. We have a playlist called Where Did the Bible Come From, and it's essentially the details of textual criticisms, so showing where these original Hebrew texts were copied and the different versions that we have, and how do we try to get back to what was originally there. So we have a whole playlist about that. So if anybody's interested in that.
So yeah, so where I was going with that was I actually recently ran into some fun that can be had with translations. In that I found it necessary to go back to the original Greek to look at the verse in Matthew about turning the other cheek. And I saw that on Blue Letter Bible, it was saying that the Greek word used for cheek there is normally translated as jawbone. So then that took me back and like, okay, well, if you go back and read the book of Judges with this new interpretation that the word for jawbone can also mean cheek, that means that Samson killed 1,000 Philistines with his ass cheek. So I know that completely butchers the meaning of the text, while at the same time keeping the meaning of the text.
Yeah, maybe it gets really at the spirit of it. You know, that's the.
So
oh gosh,
there's like part of me wants to actually go to school and study all these ancient languages just so I can write my own translation of the Bible and make it completely ridiculous like that.
That would be amazing. I would buy that.
So another question that kind of came up in this article that I wanted to get your opinion on is they're claiming that people are saying that few people in the ancient world wrote in prose, that most people wrote in history. This is another one of those claims that I've never heard before this. Like, I know there is an awful lot of ancient historical poetry that our view of what poetry is today wouldn't necessarily match up with what their view of poetry was back then. But I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that most ancient authors wrote in poetry. So can I get your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of... So I'm not a historian. So what I'm getting ready to say, everybody bear that in mind.
Yeah, but I'm talking like you do study like ancient Assyrian texts and whatnot. Like, do you find that they are mostly poetical in nature, or is there a good deal of prose or non-poetry?
Certainly not. Certainly not. So, we have all kinds of genres of text, and many of them are written in prose. If I guess for everybody to know, prose is just sort of like plain speak. Plain speech. Yep. So poetry is going to focus in on some form of rhythm or whatever it is that the culture considers to be a poetic form. It does that. So certainly we have in narratives, you have long repetitions of sections in let's say Sumerian or Akkadian texts. But we have all kinds of documentation from the ancient world. So letters, I mean, certainly letters aren't written in poetic form.
Well,
contracts, contracts aren't written poetically. Administrative texts aren't written poetically. So, I mean, if the claim is that historical texts are written poetically, I mean, we have annals. And again, this is why I prefaced it with I'm not a historian, because what is history writing is actually a complicated part of this discussion. And if that's the claim that all history was written poetically, I also think that's sort of silly. But that's probably too complicated of a discussion to get into.
See, I don't think like the article's not even just saying that all history was poetry up to that point. They're saying that people are arguing that all ancient text up to like Herodotus is poetry, or the vast majority of it is.
Yeah, I mean that's just silly. And if anybody wants to read some ancient texts, let us know. You see that stuff up there on the shelf, those are replicas of ancient tablets. So, the idea that we have hundreds of thousands, right, of these tablets, and many of them are administrative texts. So 1 sheep and 2 goats, right? These are receipts at temples. So to argue that all writing is poetic that's silly. That's silly.
So they're basically constructing a straw man so that they can then point that out as being completely silly so that they can win points. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why anyone would argue that all ancient writing was poetic. That's just doesn't deal with. I looked up the author
of this article, and I don't know that he clearly has commitments. He clearly has commitments, theological commitments.
I took a quick glance at his source, and he's using people that are on staff at Answers in Genesis as sources for this, and it's like, yeah, that kind of betrays your bias.
One of the things that I think people that take a view like I used to take, and it seems like you used to take as a fundamental evangelical Christian, that somehow the biblical text is either constructed or existed or whatever in this vacuum, and that God simply handed it down to his people, to Moses in particular, and that's just it's a nonsensical approach. So one has to very seriously engage with how the biblical text, and not just in things like creation stories, but how the biblical text in legal texts, for example, how is it affected by the wider ancient Near East and texts that came long before it? So that sort of the clearest, maybe and quintessential example would be the flood story. We know when you read through the flood story, it's borrowing heavily from Atrahasis, the Akkadian flood story from the Old Babylonian period.
Yeah,
and it's the same story that gets picked up in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you see it. I mean, it very specifically, you see it. And you in the Psalms, for example, you see borrowings from texts about from Ugarit about the god Baal, and it's just that they're getting reworked. They're getting in very much the same way as what I was talking about earlier with the Babylonian story, the Enuma Elish, being lightly reworked to fit the northern, the Assyrians' theological perspective by having the name switched out of the deity that it's attributed to. So when you think about that in relation to creation texts in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes it's more veiled. Sometimes it's very explicit, but there's intertextuality is the word that we would use. There's allusions to borrowings from ancient Near Eastern texts. So a good example of this that's I think pretty clear would be Isaiah 27:1, where it talks about Leviathan. It talks about the twisting serpent that God is going to kill in the latter times. And I don't remember Psalm 27, Isaiah 27:1 right off the top of my head, but it's sort of a loose quote from the Baal cycle, this Ugaritic text from the late Bronze Age, late second millennium BCE. And what they're doing, it's not like it's plagiarism. Megan's got a series about that, about what is plagiarism and the difference between plagiarism as we would think about it today and intertextuality in the biblical text. And she's actually showing it in the flood story. But here, what they're doing is they're taking a text, a story that they're very familiar with, this Judean scribe who's writing this text, who's been well trained in literature and mythology of the period, not just his own, but from Babylonia, from the West. It's very arguable that he knows even Egyptian mythological stories. He's taking these things and he's reworking them to say, not that deity, our deity.
Yeah.
Not that God that it's attributed to, not Baal, right? Not that Egyptian God, but ours. Yahweh is the one that did this. And so sometimes it's very clear, like in Isaiah 27 or in Psalm 104 or Psalm 74, where you have these direct allusions to, or connections, this intertextuality with this cosmic battle motif. And let me just talk about that for a second. So creation in...
Actually, if I could just interject here and ask a quick question. Do Do you think this is kind of indicative of a type of pluralism where like they would accept that like yes the Egyptian gods exist, yes Baal exists, but my god is better, and so these stories of great things that happen that you're attributing to your gods, that was actually my god?
Yeah, like a form of monolatry. So like they recognize. I mean, it's difficult to get at that right. I think the beliefs of individuals where they, but certainly, if you look at early Israel, they're polytheistic, right? They see other deities, whether and the Hebrew Bible's responding to that.
Moses I think made an Asherah pole to cure the Israelites at one point from snake bites.
The idea that there's always been this monotheism, I think, is just, I mean, again, it's not my area of specialization, but it's problematic to say the least. So I think that one of the things that we see in the ancient world, even in the first millennium, when you start to get national deities like Asher and Marduk, is that it's not a rejection of other deities. It's the supremacy of their deity. So when you see this, I think people are surprised by it because, I mean, it does appear even in early Genesis that there's a divine council, right? That God is sitting, sitting at the top of, right? And what is this divine council? And so, of course, you can sort of get out of that sort of thing with saying, well, these are angelic beings, or they're divine, but they're not gods. But it's problematic in the mindset of the ancient Israelites. So, but this mode, sorry, heard my son screaming in the background.
That's
for joy, by the way. But there is this common creation motif that we see where you have a deity that fights against like this watery god that is seen as supreme at the time, more powerful at the time.
Yeah.
But he fights against it to gain supremacy over the rest of the gods. That's how he proves it. And when he does that, when he fights against this watery deity and defeats it, creation often occurs, and a temple is built. So you see aspects of this in again the Baal cycle from Ugarit, with Baal defeating Yam, and then having his temple built, and then later he fights against the god Mot, death, and then loses, and then ultimately gains victory. But you see this in the Enuma Elish with Marduk, and Marduk is fighting against Tiamat, who is the goddess of the sea, and she's all powerful, like, seemingly. All the other deities, all the other gods are too scared, but Marduk, takes it up and defeats her without a tremendous amount of difficulty. So this motif, this sort of slaying the waters, the ancient waters, the original waters of creation, is a motif that is picked up in the Bible, and it's picked up explicitly in places like the Psalms, or in the book of Job, or in Isaiah. You have God in combat with, now not difficult combat with, right? It's not that it's tough for him. He has supremacy. But it's interesting to just sort of go on that for a second. This motif actually develops. We can see it develop even in Mesopotamian religion. So there's an older Akkadian myth that's called the Anzu myth, and just very briefly in it, the god Ninurta, the god Enlil, sort of the supreme god, has this thing called the Tablet of Destinies. Sounds really cool. And the Tablet of Destinies, if one holds it, one has ostensibly complete control over the elements, right? Complete control over nature, the world. And
that sounds like the next Indiana Jones movie.
There you go. Indiana Jones and the Tablet of Destinies. But Enlil goes and he takes a bath, and he puts the tablet of his destinies down on this, on this chair, and the Anzu bird, who's supposed to be guarding the cella of the god, takes the tablet of destinies and flies off into the mountains. And there's chaos, right? Now the tablet of destinies is in control of this big Anzu bird. Well, Ninurta goes out, the god Ninurta goes out to fight the Anzu bird to take it back. And in his first, charge at the Anzu bird, he loses because he fires these arrows at the Anzu bird, and the Anzu bird says, "Turn back, go back to your thicket," to the arrows. And the arrows, because they're made of wood, go back to the thicket. They turn away. So he loses. And he has to go get advice from the clever god, Ea. And he has to ultimately trick the Anzu bird to win. So it's not necessarily because of his might that Ninurta wins, but because he tricks, he uses his craftiness. Well,
Yeah.
this story is the basis of the Enuma Elish. And you can see it. There are articles that are written about this. We have a video of it on our channel where we talk about the connections, the intertextuality. But Marduk is the new Ninurta in the story. And it's interesting because Tiamat, who is the sea goddess, when she is threatening all the other deities, she creates these other monsters, and she takes the tablet of destinies and gives it to another god called Kingu. And Kingu is holding this tablet of destinies. And when, thinking back to the Anzu myth, you think about Ninurta charging Anzu, who has the tablet of destinies, and he gets turned back. Well, in the Enuma Elish, there is no loss. It says that as Marduk approached, his presence, the power of his presence, defeats Kingu, who is holding the tablet of destinies. So this story, he's Ninurta, revivified, whatever you want to say. He's developed in his power so much so that there's not a loss. In fact, there's not even a battle required. His mere presence, his approach, causes Kingu, who holds that same tablet of destinies, to just be defeated. So we see even this development here. Now, Marduk still fights against Tiamat, but I think you see that the development, this early development of this. So then when you get to the biblical text, and you have Yahweh fighting against, or you have Elohim, whatever, fighting against this watery deity, it's not a battle, and it's not like a real battle anymore. And so Yahweh slays the seven-headed Leviathan, right, or slays the watery chaos. And in Genesis 1, it develops even further, I would say, where that watery deity, and it's very arguable, or good arguments to say that the word tehom in Genesis 1:2 for like the abyss, the watery deep, is in fact the Semitic root, the Semitic word for Tiamat. And so it's what
Yahweh
David Carr
defeating Tiamat.
Tiamat, but he does so. Tiamat has been demythologized, is the word that they used. So it's no longer like this deity that has to be fought. It's been demythologized. Now it's just the watery deep. And what David Carr calls it's like a blind illusion, or a blind, I can't remember the term that he uses, but it's blind something, a blind motif, where if you know about the story of Tiamat, you know about that battle that's supposed to take place, and you come to Genesis 1, which of course the people would have, then they recognize, whoa, Tehom, Tiamat, like that's, but it's being presented very differently. It's not even something to be fought. And in fact, you see in later biblical texts, as you read through the Hebrew Bible, you can see Leviathan, or this watery chaos, this whole motif, this sea motif, being a creature that plays in the seas. It's not even something to be defeated. It's like a pet almost of Yahweh. So again, it's showing it's a polemic, right? It's developing, it's working with that combat myth, that motif, and reworking it in different ways to
So
show God's power.
Just to get some clarification on this,
Sure.
so Leviathan shows up as a serpent to be defeated in Isaiah 27. Was that written before or after the Genesis? Like
Tough to say. You know, it's part of probably second Isaiah, even though people would say second Isaiah starts after, it starts in chapter 40, and that's Isaiah 27. Isaiah 24 to 27 is part of what they call the little apocalypse, and it's probably written by the second Isaiah author and put back in. Anyway, that's, I guess, it's not that it's neither here nor there, but it's too technical.
I'm just like, I'm kind of trying to construct a miniature timeline in my head of like, okay, so they wrote about the serpent to be defeated in Isaiah, and then in Genesis, it wasn't even a battle. It's just, there's the chaos and void or whatever, and now it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably written roughly around the same time, but I still think I would say that Genesis 1 comes later.
I'm probably looking for patterns where there aren't any. Like, for instance, speaking of patterns where there probably aren't any, so Asher was one of the old gods, right? Do you think there's any etymological connection between Asher and the god Asher and Asher, the son of Jacob, and the tribe of Israel?
Probably not. I'm thinking of how Asher is spelled in the Hebrew Bible. I'd have to look.
It's all the same in English.
Right. No, I would say probably not. No, I mean,
Okay.
I haven't looked at that specifically, but probably not. No.
That just kind of popped into my head while you were talking about it earlier.
Yeah,
and
no.
I'm like, it's probably nothing, but I'll ask him.
No, that's where it's innovation. That's where it comes from. It's how we move forward. So,
Well, it also occurs to me, like Asher, I don't think there's any terribly important stories about Asher, so I'm not sure how there would even be a connection there. So,
Yeah.
like, if they were going to connect it with one of the older gods, it would be one of the more important tribes of Israel, I think.
yeah, I would suspect there's
Like
not a connection.
Like the Levites, Levi, Leviathan.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, probably not there either.
That being said, Megan's last name is Lewis, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean she's a descendant of the Levi's? Because
Yes, actually a direct descendant. She's actually standing behind the camera now in her vestments. So,
hi, Megan. No, I recall video I did ages ago. I did some research in that, and they actually had, like, Wikipedia has a list of surnames that are the descendants of the Levites, and Lewis is one of them.
oh wow,
So,
yeah, I do not know.
yeah. All right. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
I think there was something else that I wanted to read from the article here that I think is important, and it's under the section Secular Cosmology versus History. And he says, Moses was not a scientist commenting on some alleged natural mechanical process for the origin of the universe. He was writing under the guiding force of the Spirit of God, confer John 5:47, and speaking of divine fiat action. This is history, sacred history. What I think is important for us to recognize, of course, I would disagree with the things that were being said there, primarily because of what he means by history. Richard Averbeck in 2004 wrote an article where he talked about sort of these backgrounds to Genesis 1 and particularly Genesis 3 and the serpent motif. And, Richard Averbeck is an evangelical Christian, teaches at a Trinity seminary, and, certainly would be considered a Bible-believing Christian, right? He's a heck of a nice guy. But I think that he would disagree with that sentiment. Not that they're not writing history, because I think there can be a good argument for that. But what is it that we mean by history? And I think that's important to recognize. So I think when we hear history, what we're, what the audience and, what we hear, what comes to mind is, when somebody sits down and says, all right, what happened in, during the Civil War? They're trying to say this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And when we think of history, even though we can't do this even ourselves, but we're trying to write like as much as possible an objective view of past events, right? That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Or an objective writing of past events. And again, that's impossible, right? To do strictly objectively. But we have a different way of coming at it than they did. So there's a book out by Mark Smith who wrote on the priestly vision. It's like the priestly vision of Genesis 1. And what he's doing in a section of it, he argues he's dealing with the question, is Genesis 1 myth or is it history? And it's a complicated question. And he says, is it myth? Yes, but no. Is it history? Yes, but no. And what he's saying is that Genesis 1 as it stands or by itself contains myth. Right? It is a mythological story. You can see the mythological elements in it, right? But the way that the priestly author, his argument is, the way that the priestly author is placing Genesis 1 at the front of Genesis 1 through 11 in particular, he's placing it there as part of primeval history. He's trying to say that this shows the origins, particularly of the nation of Israel. Because as you go through, and this is probably a good thing for me to sort of end on here, if you read through this primeval history of Genesis 1 through 11, it begins with God creating all things good. And immediately, starting with, let me say it this way. If you just started with Genesis 2:4, you would begin to think that God's creation maybe wasn't good and that there were problems from the start, right?
Yeah.
But the priestly author...
First thing he says in Genesis 2:4 is, it is not good
it
for
is
man
not
to
good.
be alone.
Exactly. And so I think the priestly author is bearing that in mind and trying to respond to it in a sense and to say, he creates good, he creates good, he creates good. And then at the end, he creates, and it is very good, right?
Yeah.
And in the same way, I think that the editor of the Gilgamesh epic is taking disparate stories and bringing them together into a new story, utilizing these mythic elements, these mythological stories. In the same way, I think the author of Genesis, 1 and ultimately the editing together of Genesis 1 through 11 and even through the end of Exodus, let's say, is weaving this together in such a way to draw a theological picture that says, look, God creates good and humanity sins. And when humanity does wrong, you see the initial effects of it, the immediate effects of it in the Cain and Abel story and the murder. You see Lamech, the descent there. Genesis 5 shows the population of the earth. And then Genesis 6 shows how things have just become so bad that God has to uncreate. Right? And that's what he does. And this is why I think this is the key thing for people to recognize is the flood story is an uncreation. If you think about how Genesis 1 started, it starts with a watery mass.
Yeah.
And God, slides this plate in between and separates the waters from the waters and then creates this habitable space. The waters run down and they separate into their different areas and land appears. In the flood story, God opens up the sluices of heaven, right? The sluices of this plate.
Yeah.
And he lets the water come up from the great deep and recreate this primordial watery mass. And that's what he's doing. He's showing, again, taking these mythological elements, these individual stories, bringing them together and saying, look, he started with watery mass. Everything got so bad that he had to essentially start over, hit the reset button with this righteous guy named Noah. And even from the get-go, everything starts to fall apart. right? Noah gets drunk, and
Yeah.
everybody's doing this, seeing nakedness or sexual, whatever it is. And you have again the table of nations in Genesis 10, and this, you get people repopulating, and it gets so bad again that you have them trying to reach heaven,
Yeah.
and God has to start over again in a sense, right? Spread everybody out, and He calls one nation from Mesopotamia. He calls Abraham, and Abraham becomes he's the start of His chosen nation, the nation of Israel. And so it's a literary text, and it's developing in just such a way so that God deals with all of humanity, and then they fail. And He deals with all of humanity again, and they fail again. And God has to select His particular nation. And of course, as you and I know, and probably the audience also knows, Israel fails, right? Again and
Yeah.
again and again, they fail.
Yeah.
And so again, but this is literature. This is a theological piece of literature that's doing something, and it's trying to tell the reader now that God has worked from the beginning with sinful mankind to bring about ultimately His redemptive plan.
Yeah, that connects those stories up a lot better than I've ever even thought of it, and it makes a lot more sense than trying to take them all at face value, literally and simplistically.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, what it looks like is something I've said on this channel before, is that if you insist on taking the most simplistic, literal interpretation of the text, you are then stripping the text of all of its beauty, all of its cultural significance, all of its historical significance. You're stripping it down until it becomes a meaningless, a meaningless interpretation that is demonstrably false.
And I think that, just sort of to make a capstone maybe on this, I think that people that have this idea that the biblical authors are these ignorant goat herders is the thing that I always hear. These are elite scribes, right? These are people that have been trained in the scribal arts. And I think that in the same way that we look at the Odyssey, or the same way that we look at ancient Egyptian writings, or we look at ancient Mesopotamian writings, Sumerian literature, Akkadian literature, and we see the beauty in them, I think in the same way we need to do that with the biblical text. I said this to Megan today. A well-intentioned person who I think cares about me made the comment recently, and I understand why she did. But she said it seems like Dr. Josh prefers or promotes the ancient texts outside of the Bible, prioritizes them over the biblical texts, and says that those are the right ones. And the biblical text, if the biblical text disagrees with that, well, then it's wrong. When the reality is they're all doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And it essentially, and it would be a lot like if you and I, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm absolutely positive, but if you and I were really big Spider-Man fans, and we thought that Spider-Man and all the Spider-Man comics and the stories of Spider-Man, they were all inspired and inerrant and divinely given by God. And then we started finding out that Superman or Iron Man or Thor or whatever have different, or Batman, what is Metropolis, and what is where's Batman at? Gotham City. Like what are these places, right? Well, gosh, Gotham City is right, therefore Spider-Man, that must be wrong. Well, that would be a really foolish way to go about this. What we should say is, oh my gosh, Spider-Man is part of a genre. And Spider-Man, we shouldn't be looking at Spider-Man to try to find, to try to prove that Spider-Man was real, because look, it occurs in New York City? Because it occurs in New York City, and look, we can find out that this sign, that matches up with what we know from the period, and so that means Spider-Man must be true. Well, that would be stupid. And we all recognize that would be stupid. Yeah. What we should be doing is saying, oh, Spider-Man is part of a wider genre, and that genre has really interesting stories. And if we want to get at the truth of Spider-Man or the truth of Thor or the truth of, whatever other comics, Iron Man, it's not looking for historical validity. It's saying what are the lessons that we can learn? What is it that Iron Man is trying to show us? What is the writer trying to show us? What is the truth value here? And what can we take away from this, morally or ethically, or even just, basic life lessons? What can we take from this? Instead of trying to read into it I don't even want to say literal reading, but some inspired meaning that requires things to be literally and historically true in that sense. I think that's a good analogy to what we should be doing with the biblical text and with text from the wider ancient Near East.
Yeah, so it's like you brought up a good point. Like I don't think I've ever heard anyone refer to Homer or any of these other ancient Near Eastern texts as being the writings of ignorant goat herders, right, whereas the Bible is doing the exact same thing in the exact same genre. So I think the existence of people who insist on taking it at face value in a simplistic manner, they make it possible for us to say, oh, this is just the writings of ignorant goat herders, because if you look at it simplistically, it doesn't make literal sense.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I will admit that you can probably find a clip of me on my channel saying something along those lines, probably from my older videos when I was more of an angry... Everybody goes through the angry atheist stage when they start. But yeah, I've kind of come around on that myself, because like these books do have cultural and historic value, even if they're not true on their face.
I mean, one of the things that I will say is that, if you're coming at it, I think there's some justification for it. If you're coming at it from, that sort of interpretive model where you've got this inerrant text that's supposed to be scientifically accurate, well, then it becomes really problematic, because if they're writing it to be scientifically and historically accurate in that sense, well, they did a very poor job, right? It's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that it's wrong if you're coming at it from that perspective. And so, yeah, then God is dumb, right? I mean, like from that perspective, why is God getting that wrong? But of course, I think that's because we're coming at it. If you come at it from that perspective, it's a wrong way to approach
flip it
the text.
around. The people writing the text were not necessarily the ignorant ones. It's the people that are insisting on the ignorant interpretation of the text.
Yes, that is a very good way to say that. Yep.
All right. So I think that just about does it. I don't have any more questions for you. If there's anything else you want to touch on.
I really appreciate you having me on, and it's been a lot of fun.
I appreciate that you, apparently, from my perspective, it looked like you dropped everything you were doing to start researching this topic for me as soon as I asked you to come on the channel. I appreciate that.
a bit, but it was good. I mean, it's good. It's good for me. I've wanted to dig into, in a much more serious manner. It's funny because I've spent so much time writing books recently. So I wrote that book on slavery, which I think has taken up an awful lot of time doing the research on slavery, and of course writing that Sumerian grammar. And I just finished writing a book on scribal education, actually, how students learned in the ancient world and how they prayed. How people prayed in the ancient world. So it should be a really interesting book. Those are shameless plugs.
When can we look forward to that one?
Yeah, that one, Megan is doing the copy editing. I mean, she's reading through it now, and we're going to send it off to an actual copy editor, and then publish it, I would hope, by fall. I mean, it should be, it's written. So it should be out by the fall. But people can go to our website, digitalhammurabi.com. Or if you just search on Joshua Bowen on Amazon, I'm sure it'll come up. My books, Megan co-authored the Sumerian book as well. But it really helps us. Honestly, the place that we make the most money from our channel, where we get most of our support from things like that, are from book sales. So if people buy our book, it's actually really, really helpful to us, because we're publishing them. Digital Hammurabi Press. So yeah, it should be good.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether I'm going to put this video up before or after my video responding to the article. So either look out for my video on that, or I hope you've already watched it, whichever works out. Go check out Digital Hammurabi. It's an excellent YouTube channel for some of the more educational stuff. There's some fun videos on there too. I particularly enjoyed the erotic fiction playlist.
Yeah. Or the Gilgamesh rap.
Yeah. There's a lot of fun stuff over on their channel too, so go check out Josh and Megan at Digital Hammurabi. Thank you so much for watching. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Vice.